Have you ever made secret plans or suddenly changed routines without telling anyone? Have you ever met with someone who wasn't who you thought they were? Have you ever been in a situation, through no fault of your own, where you felt that things were very, very wrong? This is the true, unsolved story of Chiho Anjitsu. This video is on a case that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole due to the scattered, sparse information that can be found about it, so please forgive me if the structure is a little chaotic in places. If you're a returning viewer or someone new to the channel, welcome. I make videos on Japanese cases, strange, solved and unsolved. If that sounds like something you think you'll find interesting, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It really helps the channel grow. In any case, I hope you enjoy my content. Let's get on with the video. 20-year-old Chiho Anjitsu was the second of three sisters born into a loving family in what was then known as Matto, a city near Kanazawa in Ishikawa Prefecture. Her father was vice president of the city's swimming society, and his love for the activity must have rubbed off on Chiho. While in high school, she was the captain of the swimming club and led them to success in many tournaments, as we can see from the trophies in this photo. During this time, when Chiho was a student, she was held in high regard by her friends, classmates, and teachers.
同性からも、あと異性からも好かれる、本当に明るくて活発で優しい子でした。
Upon graduation, she chose to make her hobby a career and began working at a local swimming school as an instructor. And just like her school days, she was described as being very caring, kind, and having a bright personality. While working there, she became close with male co-workers as well as female ones, but it seemed she didn't have a boyfriend at the time, at least not to anyone's knowledge. This has also been confirmed in her personal diary, which she wrote until around May 1992 before stopping abruptly for unknown reasons. And it was 5 months after this when something would happen. The 30th of September 1992 started like any other day, and Chiho drove 6 to 7 kilometers from her family home to the swimming school where she worked. She brought a homemade spaghetti lunchbox to eat in the afternoon between lessons, but because the swimming school surprised staff by providing lunch for them, she ate the spaghetti for dinner at the end of her shift just before 9:45 PM. Naturally, this makes sense as it means no food is wasted, but it was seen as a little bit noteworthy as we'll find out later on. Since she lived only a 10-minute drive away, she could have just eaten it when she arrived home. Instead of this, however, according to a staff member who saw her, she hastily ate her dinner in the staff room as though she had something to do afterwards. Despite this, things were very normal at the swimming school during her shift, and by all accounts, Chiho did a fantastic job teaching students as she always did. No one noticed anything particularly odd or saw anything suspicious. After finishing her spaghetti dinner, she left the building, got into her parked car in space number 2 at the staff car park, and drove away at just before 7:15 PM. While this seems ordinary, there was again something else that was a bit noteworthy here too. According to another staff member who witnessed her leaving, she drove out of the east gate. Since her home was in a southwestern direction from the swimming pool, she always drove out of the west exit on the opposite side instead. The reason for this change remains unclear because, unfortunately, this was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Hours pass and Chiho's mother was beginning to worry. It was getting late and her daughter was nowhere to be seen. The swimming school was open until 10 PM, but if Chiho worked that late at night, she always called her family to let them know. She was close to her family after all, and habitually called them if she was going to be late home or something came up. When it reached 11 PM, the mother really began to fear that something was wrong. She called some of Chiho's co-workers and became even more concerned. They all said that she left the swimming school after finishing her shift as usual, and were just as confused as the mother was. They had no idea what happened. Chiho's father was out drinking with his own co-workers at the time, but the mother contacted him via pager and asked that he return home at once. Since the swimming school was not far from the home and the mother was fed up of waiting, she decided to drive down with her eldest daughter, Chiho's older sister, while the younger sister stayed at home and the father made his way back from his work outing. After first dropping by a sports park Chiho frequented near the family home, the mother and sister arrived at the swimming school car park, and to their surprise, Chiho's car was there in its usual parking space. Well, almost. It was slightly parked over space number 3 too, but it was indeed her car. They raced to the vehicle and also noticed that it had crashed into the concrete block in front of the spot. They peered inside through the window and saw Chiho. She was lying down on the fully reclined passenger seat, but because it was in the middle of the night, it was hard to see things clearly. Believing that she was asleep, they tried to wake her up by opening the passenger seat door, but it was locked. So they went to the driver's side, opened it, and it is then when they noticed that something was off. The mother and sister received no response when they tried to talk to Chiho, and when they touched her, she was cold. The mother turned on the interior light and saw marks on Chiho's neck and dirt on her clothes. She wasn't breathing, and unfortunately, she wasn't alive. The poor mother had now experienced the worst nightmare a parent can ever have. Kind Chiho, who was so full of life, so happy just a few hours ago, was no more. In a panic, she ran to a nearby snack bar, one of the few businesses open at this time of night, and requested that they call the authorities immediately. Police arrived at the scene quickly, and after cordoning off the area and investigating well into the morning of the next day, they made a number of important and strange observations. First, let's go back to the car. It was a black Mitsubishi Mirage Fabio. Chiho's parents bought it for her upon graduation so that she could drive to work. As previously mentioned, her designated parking space was number 2, and her car was found in this very same spot, but partially parked into space number 3 too. The front bumper had also been damaged after crashing into the concrete block at the end of the space, suggesting that it had been parked in a hurry. The key was in the ignition, but the engine was not on, and the shift stick was put into drive. The cassette radio was playing, but the volume was turned right down so it was muted. Because of these things, plus the fact that Chiho was found in the passenger seat, investigators believe that someone unfamiliar with the car had driven it back to the car park and quickly fled the scene. Chiho's shoulder bag, which included money and other valuables, was left on the back seat, and while unknown fingerprints had been taken from a cassette tape case from inside the dashboard, investigators don't think that they belonged to the suspect or that anything was taken. Therefore, the motive wasn't theft. But the strangest thing about the car was the exterior. The wheels and lower part of it were covered in dirt, implying that it must have driven off-road at some point. Since they were in the middle of an urban area, it came at quite a surprise to the detectives. And now, unfortunately, we get to Chiho herself, and the mystery continues. First, her right shoe was completely missing, and the left shoe was not on her foot, but was instead on the floor of the car. Her clothing, a black top and blue denim overalls, were completely covered in dirt, especially at the back, and a 20cm hole was cut into the abdomen area of the overalls. A small hole was also cut into the groin area, but Chiho herself had not suffered injuries from these. Her lunchbox bag had been placed over this area of her body, seemingly to hide the damage to the clothes from anyone who looked in the car. According to experts, the marks on her throat were consistent with those seen in cases of suffocation. It appears that something was used to compress the throat, and the marks continued even behind her ears. Strangely, at the back of the mouth and down her throat, blades of grass and leaves were discovered, which, like the dirt on the car, implied that something had happened in a rural area. Saliva that belonged to a man with type A, B or B blood was discovered on Chiho's upper body, and there were marks consistent with physical trauma on her left cheek and chin. Since foreign DNA couldn't be found under Chiho's fingernails, investigators believe that she was unable to put up much resistance. The police also interviewed her co-workers, but none of them could give much information other than what I've already discussed. One co-worker who worked late stated that he did see the car in the parking lot at around 9 PM, meaning that the incident must have occurred between 7:30 and 8:45 PM. But the biggest mystery of all was something found in Chiho's hair. A leaf was found tangled in the strands. It was taken to a lab for testing, and 3 days later they were shocked at the result.
これ普通メタセコイアって言っておりましてね、日本には自生してない植物です。
Metasequoia is a very rare tree. It is so rare that it was thought to be extinct until a small number of them were discovered in central China in the mid-20th century, and it is still an endangered tree to this day. It is considered to be an example of a living fossil species, and as mentioned by the expert, this uncommon tree doesn't even grow in Japan. So the question is, how did a Metasequoia leaf end up at a murder crime scene? Officers scoured the area, consulted local biologists and nature experts, and asked the public for any help to locate this type of tree. It didn't grow naturally in Japan, but there had to be one somewhere. Then one day, investigators tracked it down. It was planted in an agricultural testing facility where experts tested how various trees and plants grew in different conditions. It was still a young sapling standing 4 meters tall, so the people looking for it had a very good eye. Once the detectives finally discovered it, they sealed off the area and began investigating. Surprisingly, the location of this facility was very close to Chiho's home, being only a few hundred meters away. Despite this, however, it was in a very isolated place with few people, especially at night when the incident occurred. Police were able to find tire tracks that exactly matched Chiho's car, and barely 5 meters away from the entrance was her missing right shoe and hair that matched her DNA upon testing. This was definitely the location where this horrendous crime took place. After conducting an investigation of the area, they were able to find drag marks on the ground. From the dirt on Chiho's clothing and the circumstances surrounding her shoes, it is believed that someone must have come up behind Chiho and committed a horrible act before dragging her along the ground by her feet and placing her in the passenger seat of the car. Chiho's hair at the facility also gave investigators more clues because something unusual had also been found in that. 2 strands of white wool, roughly 3.8 centimeters in length. This wasn't just any wool though, because technically it wasn't commercially available. It was strikingly similar to the industrial wool made by a company in Toyama Prefecture for baubles on woolen hats. Therefore, it is theorized that the perpetrator either wore a woolen hat or was close to someone who did. Since baubles on hats is common among children in Japan, authorities also theorized that the person responsible was close to children. Police were also thrilled when they found a gasoline stand receipt dated on the night that Chiho passed away. They initially believed that it could be the key to unlocking the mystery of who did this, but after tracking down the owners, they realized it was unrelated. Instead, it belonged to an innocent couple who had visited the area. They were there from around 9:30 to 10 PM, but never witnessed Chiho, her car, or anything else suspicious. Unfortunately, this lead was a dead end. So now that we have discussed everything found by investigators up to this point, the question is, who did this terrible, unforgivable act? Chiho was a nice, hardworking person with no enemies, and was not the type of person to willingly involve herself with bad people. Well, let's go back to the beginning. The hastily eaten meal, Chiho leaving the car park via a different exit than usual. It seemed that she had something planned, so while a random attack is still a possibility, I and the investigators believe that this was done by someone who knew her. And of course, we get to the car. Since the perpetrator managed to park in Chiho's designated parking spot after she had already died, it appears he knew a lot of details about her, and it was not a mere coincidence. This means the man was not a stranger, but instead must have been an acquaintance of Chiho's, who knew exactly where she worked and where she parked. And there is something else about the agricultural testing facility. You remember the petrol stand receipt belonging to the couple I mentioned a short while ago? Well, it wasn't linked directly to the crime, but it does offer a hint. The area was isolated, rural, and yet open to anyone since no gates or fences were installed. This meant that it was frequented by couples who wanted to spend some time alone together, not just for physical activities, but also simply to hang out, to chat, and get out of the house. Maybe Chiho was out on a date with a secret boyfriend who held an unknown darkness within him, and he unleashed it upon innocent Chiho. Or maybe they were close friends, but the man wanted to be something more than that. Maybe Chiho rejected his advances, completely within her right, which caused him to snap. Seeing as the perpetrator seemingly knew the victim, you'd think that this was a pretty simple case to solve since the police had certain leads to pursue, but things were not so smooth. During the initial stages of the investigation, the most crucial and important time for such crimes, the investigation team was split into two groups. One group was set up at the police station near where the body was discovered, and another at the main Mato police station. This meant that communication was very poor, and even basic information sharing was hindered, which caused confusion and meant that things moved very slowly. There was also a problem with high-ranking people who ran the police in the city. Because they were so terrified of leaks to the media, they heavily restricted access to information on the case, even among the top investigators assigned to it. This meant that detectives' reasoning and ability to pursue leads was also hindered since they couldn't gain access to all the information and evidence that would allow them to understand the case better. An example of this is the wool I mentioned before. High-ranking investigators knew about this, but they were ordered to keep it secret from the detectives actively out investigating for fear of a leak. And it was only revealed to them once the investigation hit a complete dead end. Despite these issues, however, naturally people of interest did surface. At the very beginning, the number swelled to a whopping 5,583 people, but this was reduced to 1,500 people fairly quickly. Of those, the chief investigator on the case at the time, Torao Nakamura, said that the police were 60 to 70% sure it was one particular man, but Torao even went as far as to say he was personally almost 100% sure. In his book entitled Sorry Chiho, Torao gave this man the pseudonym Yamada. The book is unable to go into great detail about Yamada since he was only a suspect and therefore never charged with a crime, but Torao gave some pretty compelling insights into this man. Yamada became a suspect very early on and was even included in a list of 20 people considered to be likely culprits of the crime. But after being investigated and interviewed, he was able to provide a strong alibi and was therefore removed from the investigation in May 1993, about half a year after the incident. However, in June 1994, once it was revealed that his blood type, B, was the only one of the 20 people to match the saliva found on Chiho's body, police once again looked into him. Unfortunately, since it was the early 90s, DNA testing and profiling wasn't really a thing in Japan, so the saliva sample wasn't stored properly. However, the matching blood type was enough to get the police moving again on Yamada. Yamada's alibi was checked again, and it was discovered through a third party that he wasn't seen in the place he said he was between 7:15 and 8:50 PM on the day the crime took place. In other words, from the time Chiho left the pool until the time when her car was seen again in the car park at 8:50, he had no alibi. After learning of this, the police under Chief Investigator Torao traced his activities on the day and came up with a likely theory of what had happened. After Chiho left work, she drove north towards Kanazawa City. Torao said that, based on Yamada's location at the time, it is highly likely that he met Chiho in a restaurant car park. Yamada's car was seen there on the day, after all. An eyewitness also saw Chiho's car being driven by a young man in this location, so it is likely that Yamada met Chiho and drove her car while she was sat in the passenger seat. It is also worth noting here that this sighting was reported to the police very early on in the investigation, but it was ignored because the sighting was north of the pool and therefore in the complete opposite direction of the scene of the crime. Even when the witness matched 2 numbers to the license plate, police dismissed it in the early stages, but it became more credible once Yamada was discovered. It is believed that the man drove south, coincidentally near the victim's home, and they made their way onto a road known colloquially as Motel Road. This is because, as I am sure you can gather from the name, it contains 6 motels in close proximity to one another, some of which still exist today. Torao believes that Yamada tried to convince Chiho to go to a motel with him, which she refused. Therefore, Yamada turned into the agricultural testing facility just off the motel road and attempted to perform a sick, obscene act on her after she refused his advances. Torao then believes that Chiho fled the car after a struggle before Yamada caught up with her and strangled her with the strap of her overalls. The marks on her neck indeed matched with the fastenings of the strap. You may be wondering, well, why would he drive the car back to the pool? Torao has an answer for this too. Yamada supposedly did it for 2 reasons. First, they were in the middle of a rural area at night, so there was no public transport and no way for Yamada to return back to the city. Therefore, he had no choice but to drive Chiho's car. If he tried to run back to the city on the highway, he would have been spotted. Second, Torao speculates that Yamada did this to speed up the discovery of Chiho's body in order to secure his alibi. It is thought that Yamada believed that if the body was found at the time where he was in a separate location, he wouldn't be linked to the crime as easily. When he supposedly parked the car back at the swimming pool at around 8:40 PM, 10 minutes before it was witnessed by one of Chiho's co-workers, he was seen by a member of the public, but she wasn't considered a reliable witness by the investigation team because she was a fortune teller. Of course though, and I want to make this clear, all of this is just speculation. Yamada couldn't be linked conclusively to the crime since there was no concrete evidence. The only thing that could solve this would be a confession, but it never came, and so the case remains unsolved. And in 2007, 15 years had passed, meaning that the crime hit the statute of limitations, which was a thing in Japan for murder until 2010. Here is a video of authorities shutting down the investigation team when the clock struck midnight, and with that, all investigations ceased, and the case was shelved. The chief investigator, Torao, as briefly mentioned before, released a book detailing the crime and his regret for not solving it. He also directed a movie titled after his own name, which dramatizes the case. While it is too late to solve now, the perpetrator is thought to still be alive to this day. I hope he does the right thing and confesses to the crime. While he cannot be punished for it now, it is the least he can do to help the family get closure. Thank you for watching my 33rd YouTube video. If you liked it, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you wish to see more videos like this about Japan. Despite the unique clues found during this case, it seems authorities hit a dead end pretty quickly at the beginning. If the police was better organized, I wonder if they could have gotten to the bottom of this quicker. It seems that Torao was pretty convinced that they had their man, but without the necessary evidence, he couldn't be linked to the crime. I wonder if Yamada was a close friend of Chiho's, or even a co-worker at the swimming pool. In the end though, unless the person responsible finally comes forward for their savage, unjust attack against such a kind, young woman, we will never know. Anyway, that's enough from me. Until next time, goodbye.